Just a quick video I wanted to make taking a look at the roster after the 2022 season. This is a list of at least the major contributors to the team in 2022, and I've tried to color code it using four different colors. For green, that means they are under contract or at least under team control in 2023. Team options are yellow. We only got one with Will Myers. Player options in 2023 are in pink, and unrestricted free agents are in red. And just taking a look at the major contributors, I didn't include everyone like Matt Beattie. I just didn't feel like that was super necessary. The first thing that strikes me is losing two of the five starters. And I know Clevenger and Mania are not the best. Statistically, they're, a little worse than average. I do think to their credit, these five starters right here, and not really including Gore, because he was a starter for a couple games at least. They got us into the playoffs. 89 wins is very good. We made it, a couple rounds into the playoffs. And even though Clevenger and Mania, the end of the season kind of left a sour taste in a lot of our mouths with their performance in the playoffs, I think as free agents, we might be able to bring back one of them on a cheap deal. And as a fifth person, in a five-man rotation, that may not be the worst thing in the world. I don't think they are playoff quality starters. We saw that this year. But at the same time, as a fifth person, not going out and spending a lot of money, hopefully, to get one of these guys to come back, and then actually really bringing in a fourth arm that is a true upgrade. And maybe that upgrade is in Nick Martinez. He's got the player option in 2023. A lot of people think he's going to test free agency, probably ask for a little bit more money, and honestly, he probably deserves it with what he was able to do this last season. He basically did it all. If it included throwing the baseball, he did it. He closed out games. He set up closers. He started games. He was a long reliever. I'd love to see Nick back. I think he was absolutely worth it, along with Robert Suarez, who's also a player option. He, maybe he will come back, but it's likely that he is going to be commanding a much higher price tag based on what we saw last year. He had a very, very rough start, but by the end of the season, I would argue that he was probably our best setup person. Him and Nick were fantastic, kind of wherever they were. Another idea for starters is Adrian Morejon. There's at least talk about San Diego wanting to stretch him out into a starter. I think that's possible. I don't know if he's necessarily an upgrade statistically from Clevenger Mania. So, maybe he plays kind of a swing role where he does some spot starts or some long middle innings, kind of like Nick Martinez did this season. But that's kind of, the first thing that jumps off at me. Will Myers is almost assuredly not coming back on his current option for $20 million. He's just not worth it. I love Will, but not for $20 million. I could see him coming back for a much cheaper deal, 1-2 years maybe. And part of the reason is that Brandon Drury, Josh Bell, the two players who are really playing first base are free agents. They're gone. And Will Myers was kind of that other person who took first base, and we don't currently have a true first baseman. So, maybe he comes back for a cheap deal, plays some first base, which I think he was surprisingly good at. Or maybe not surprisingly, but he was, a very decent first baseman. I'd love to see Drury or Bell back. I think Bell is the more likely between the two to leave. Just he has a longer track record of success. He was awful with us after the trade deadline. And, maybe that makes it a little bit cheaper. Maybe he comes back on a 1-year deal, a bit of a deal for the Padres where he can, kind of bring his stats up and then look for a bigger deal after that. I don't know. Drury's at least, I think, a possibility of not being too expensive to bring back while also kind of providing a little bit of slugging, which the team is sorely lacking, and playing first base. There's a lot of options for the infield. I mean, personally, I think the Padres have one of the more loaded middle infields between Tatis, Kim, and Cronenworth. I think you've got three excellent middle infielders, and there's talk about moving Tatis to the outfield. I think that could absolutely work. I don't know if he slots into center field and Grisham becomes kind of the fourth bench, outfielder where he comes in to relieve when Tatis inevitably gets hurt. And that's another point where Tatis hasn't played a full season yet. So having Tatis as the starting shortstop, I think is good in concept. But then, if he gets hurt again, or God forbid he gets suspended again, what's the plan after that? Machado's a lock. I really do think that Kim has made a very strong case for being a starting shortstop. There's options about possibly moving him over to second, Cronenworth to first. I do think there's some risk in that you're taking a two-time All-Star at second base and moving him to first base. The flip side of that is people have mentioned that the shift is being banned in 23. So you might have Tatis, who, at least through some defensive metrics, is a elite defensive shortstop. You got Tatis at short. You've got Kim at second, who is, in my opinion, a Gold Glove worthy middle infielder. You've got Machado at the hot corner, and then a very good defensive player in Cronenworth. And I think you could make an argument for those four being the best defensive infield as a group, possibly in baseball. That's a really exciting possibility. But I do think that there's a little bit of danger of you losing some of the, ability of Cronenworth at second, where if you leave him at second and Kim at short and move Tatis to the outfield, you're essentially kind of replacing a weaker link in Trent Grisham, at least offensively, I should say. Grisham's a very good defensive center fielder, even though he had a few slip ups in certain games throughout the season. Overall, statistically, he was one of the best in defense. But, he hit below the Mendoza line, on average this season, and that's just not good enough. And he had a bit of a resurgence early in the playoffs, which was fantastic. I don't know what happens with Grisham. He's still in his arbitration years, so he's under team control. I do think with such a poor season, he's not going to be as expensive in those arbitration years, at least next year, as he probably could have been. But what does Preller and Melvin decide to do with him? Do they kind of trust him, which is what they did this year? Of course, they didn't really have many options to replace Grisham with. So center field's one of those questions that we're going to need answered in this offseason. Left field is another interesting, position with Profar, who kind of excelled in left field. He really kind of popped in there. And I remember at the beginning of the season, I, along with many others, were kind of wondering what the Padres were going to do with left field. Profar kind of just slid right in and was essentially just the starter from the beginning of the season and held it down the whole time. And, some people think that he's going to test free agency and see what he can get now that he's kind of proved, that he could succeed in the outfield. Maybe go into a team who's desperate for some outfield depth and seeing what he can get on the open market. The only other big thing, I talked about the pitching with Martinez and with Suarez possibly leaving. I also think catcher's an interesting position for the Padres this offseason. I quite liked Alfaro. I think statistically, at least on defense with framing, he was a little bit better than Nola, who was not fantastic. He had a little bit better pop time than Nola, who again was not fantastic. And occasionally out-hit Nola. Definitely came through with some clutch hits at the very least. So I liked Alfaro, but it doesn't seem like the Padres do, with Alfaro not making any appearances in the playoffs and Nola catching every single game taking every at bat. As some people have rightly pointed out, Alfaro didn't even pinch hit in the playoffs. So I don't know exactly what message that sends to Alfaro from the Padres organization. Taking a look at the stats last year, I thought Nola was probably the weaker of the two catchers, offensively and defensively as a catcher. But that is not what Melvin, it doesn't look like Melvin agrees with me. So, I wonder if Alfaro becomes, a trade piece in this offseason, possibly with Luis Campusano coming up. Of course, he is not a proven major league player, and that's kind of the danger. I would love to see more Campusano, but he, in his very few stints that he's had, has not really had the kind of success that he's shown in AAA. And his AAA stats offensively are fantastic. And I do think some of that is probably a lack of familiarity with the pitchers. And I think a good offseason spring training, with no lockout, that might help Campusano kind of slide into the second, possibly even the first catcher role for the Padres. But this is, again, just a kind of a quick video taking a look at the roster, some of the moves that I think the Padres could be taking a look at. You got to replace some players. There's some key contributors who are leaving. And of course, there's a good core that is going to remain with the team in 2023. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. I would love to hear any of your thoughts, agreements, disagreements down in the comments, and just hear what you think.